Greetings and welcome back to the Global Business Channel. Thank you for joining us once again today. In this video, we'll be discussing Recommendation 6 of the Financial Action Task Force's 40 recommendations concerning targeted financial sanctions related to terrorism and terrorism financing in Part C of the FATF Recommendation Handbook. Additionally, we'll be reviewing the 13 interpretative notes accompanying Recommendation 6, found on pages 45 to 52 of the handbook. We publish weekly videos on topics related to the offshore global business, corporate, financial, and compliance sectors. We encourage you to subscribe to the channel and give this video a thumbs up if you find these topics interesting. Lastly, for ease of reference, all videos are arranged in playlists which we have created on various subject matters, so feel free to browse through them. Without further delay, let's get started with today's video. Recommendation 6 mandates countries to establish and enforce targeted financial sanctions regimes in accordance with the United Nations Security Council resolutions aimed at preventing and suppressing terrorism and its financing. These resolutions require nations to immediately freeze funds or assets and ensure that no resources, financial or otherwise, are made available directly or indirectly to any individual or entity, either one, designated by the United Nations Security Council under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, including Resolution 1267 of 1999 and its subsequent resolutions, or number 2, designated by the country in line with Resolution 1373 of 2001. For background and reference purposes, let's take a few moments to cover the UN Security Council, Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, UN Resolution 1267 of 1999, and UN Resolution 1373 of 2001. The United Nations Security Council, or UNSC, is one of the 6 principal organs of the United Nations tasked with maintaining international peace and security. It has the authority to make binding decisions on member states, including sanctions, peacekeeping missions, and the authorization of military action. The UNSC is composed of 15 members, 5 permanent members being China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, with veto power, and 10 non-permanent members elected for 2-year terms. Its decisions play a central role in conflict resolution and global security initiatives. Chapter 7 of the UN Charter allows the United Nations Security Council to take enforcement action to maintain or restore international peace and security. It provides the UNSC with the authority to determine threats to peace, breaches of peace, or acts of aggression, and to take military and non-military measures such as sanctions or the use of force to address such threats. This chapter empowers the UNSC to act decisively, including authorizing military interventions to ensure global security. It is crucial for managing conflicts and responding to international crises. Resolution 1267, adopted in 1999, established a sanctions regime targeting the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan for providing a safe haven to the late Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. It called for the freezing of funds and resources linked to individuals associated with terrorism. The resolution also created the 1267 Committee, responsible for monitoring and updating the sanctions list, which evolved to cover individuals, groups, and entities tied to terrorism, particularly Al-Qaeda and later ISIS. The framework has been a key tool in global counter-terrorism efforts by enforcing asset freezes, travel bans, and arms embargoes. Resolution 1373, adopted in 2001, following the 9/11 attacks in the United States, focuses on strengthening international efforts to combat terrorism. It obliges all UN member states to prevent and suppress the financing of terrorist acts, criminalize terrorist financing, and freeze assets related to terrorism. The resolution also requires countries to cooperate in the investigation and prosecution of terrorist activities and share intelligence. Additionally, it calls for enhanced border controls and stronger legal frameworks to prevent terrorist activities globally. The resolution marked a significant step in global counter-terrorism efforts by mandating these actions under international law. We will now be reviewing and summarizing the 13 interpretative notes accompanying this recommendation. Interpretative Note 1 regarding the recommendation's objective states that Recommendation 6 mandates countries to implement targeted financial sanctions in alignment with the UNSC resolutions. These sanctions focus on freezing without delay the funds or assets of individuals and entities designated under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. This includes those identified by the UNSC under Resolution 1267 of 1999 and its successors, as well as those designated by the respective country in line with UNSC Resolution 1373 of 2001. The primary aim is to prevent terrorism financing by restricting access to financial resources. Interpretative Note 2, still concerning the recommendation's objective, stipulates that the obligations under Recommendation 6 do not replace other existing legal measures for dealing with funds or assets during criminal, civil, or administrative cases, as required by Recommendation 4, which concerns confiscation and provisional measures. Instead, the focus of Recommendation 6 is on preventive measures aimed at stopping the flow of money to terrorist groups. These measures can complement legal actions but are not dependent on them. Additionally, countries must ensure that they respect human rights and the rule of law and protect innocent third parties while implementing these anti-terrorism measures. Interpretative Note 3 concerns identifying and designating persons and entities financing and or supporting terrorist activities. It asserts that under UN Resolution 1267 and its related resolutions, the 1267 Committee handles designations related to Al-Qaeda, while the 1988 Committee focuses on designations tied to the Taliban and threats to Afghanistan, both under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. For UN Resolution 1373, designations are made by individual countries or groups of countries, either on their own or at the request of another country. A designation is made if the country believes there are reasonable grounds to suspect that the person or entity meets the criteria set in Resolution 1373. Interpretative Note 4, still on the same subject matter, argues that countries must have both the authority and effective systems to identify and propose individuals or entities for designation under UN Resolution 1267 and its related resolutions. These mechanisms are vital for ensuring that countries can recommend individuals and entities to the UN Security Council for listing as required by the resolution. Similarly, countries need authority and procedures to designate individuals or entities under Resolution 1373, which allows nations to identify those involved in terrorism and propose their designation. These measures are crucial for implementing both sets of resolutions effectively. In summary, countries must establish systems for proposing and designating individuals and/or entities, ensuring they meet the criteria laid out in the relevant UN resolutions. Subnote A stipulates that countries should assign a competent authority or a court to manage three key responsibilities related to UN's counterterrorism resolutions. Number one, proposal to the 1267 Committee. The authority should propose individuals or entities for designation under Security Council Resolution 1989 of 2011, focused on Al-Qaeda, if they believe there is sufficient evidence supporting the criteria for designation. Number two, proposal to the 1988 Committee. The authority should also be responsible for proposing individuals or entities under Resolution 1988 focused on the Taliban and associated threats to Afghanistan, again based on adequate evidence. And number three, designation under Resolution 1373. The authority should identify and designate individuals or entities based on their own assessments or in response to requests from other countries, ensuring there are reasonable grounds to suspect the proposed designee meets the criteria under Resolution 1373. This ensures effective and evidence-based implementation of the counter-terrorism measures. Subnote B states that countries should establish a system to identify individuals or entities for designation based on criteria from Resolutions 1988, 1989, and 1373, among others. This system should include the authority and effective procedures to review and act on actions taken by other countries under these resolutions. For effective international cooperations, countries should promptly assess whether requests from other nations are supported by reasonable grounds or a solid basis to suspect that the targeted individual or entity meets the designation criteria specified in Resolution 1373. Subnote C stipulates that the responsible authorities should have the legal powers and procedures to gather as much information as possible from all relevant sources to identify people or groups that, based on reasonable grounds, meet the criteria for designation set out in the relevant Security Council resolutions. Subnote D asserts that when deciding whether to propose or make a designation, countries should use an evidentiary standard of, quote, reasonable grounds, unquote, or, quote, reasonable basis, unquote. For designations under Resolution 1373, each country's authority will follow its own legal system's rules about the type and amount of evidence needed to determine that these reasonable grounds exist for designating a person or entity and to start freezing their assets. This applies whether the designation is initiated by the country itself or requested by another country. Such designations do not require a criminal case to be in progress. Subnote E argues that when submitting names to the 1267 Committee for inclusion on the Al-Qaeda sanctions list based on Resolution 1267 and related resolutions, countries should, number one, follow the committee's procedures and standard forms for listing. Number two, provide as much relevant information as possible about the person or entity, especially enough identifying details for accurate identification, and if possible, the information needed by Interpol to issue a special notice. Number three, submit a detailed statement explaining why the person or entity meets the criteria for designation, including supporting evidence and connections to others on the list. This statement should be shared upon request except for any confidential parts. And number four, indicate whether the identity as the designated country can be disclosed. Subnote F states that when countries propose names to the 1988 Committee for inclusion on the Taliban sanctions list under UN Security Council Resolution 1988 and its successors, they must, number one, adhere to listing procedures by following the prescribed procedures set by the 1988 Committee for listing individuals or entities. Number two, provide comprehensive information by offering detailed and relevant information on the proposed individual or entity, including identifying details for accurate identification and any data needed by Interpol for issuing a special notice. Number three, submit a detailed statement of case. The proposal should include a detailed rationale for the listing, such as specific reasons for believing the person or entity qualifies for designation. This should also show any connection with already designated individuals or entities. The statement must be public if requested, except for confidential sections. This process ensures that designations are based on comprehensive, transparent, and verifiable information. Subnote G stipulates that when a country requests another to enforce actions under the freezing mechanisms from UN Resolution 1373, it should provide detailed information on the person or entity's identity with enough specifics for accurate identification. Evidence supporting why that person or entity qualifies for designation based on relevant criteria from UN Security Council resolutions. This helps ensure that the freezing actions are justified and properly targeted. And lastly, Subnote H stipulates that countries should have processes that allow them to take legal action without the presence of the person or entity being considered for designation. This ensures that decisions can be made efficiently when designating individuals or organizations for sanctions or similar actions. Section C concerns freezing and prohibiting dealings in funds or other assets of designated persons and entities. And Interpretative Note 5 states that countries are required to impose targeted financial sanctions immediately on individuals or entities designated by the 1267 and 1988 committees, which operate under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. This obligation extends to freezing assets and prohibiting transactions with those designated, including under UN Resolution 1373. For the latter, freezing actions must occur quickly when a country either independently or upon another country's request determines there are reasonable grounds to suspect the designated individual or entity meets the criteria for sanctions. Interpretative Note 6, still on the same subject matter, stipulates that countries should create the required legal powers and designate domestic authorities responsible for enforcing and implementing targeted financial sanctions following these standards and procedures. A. Countries, and in the case of the EU, under EU law, should require all individuals and organizations within their borders to immediately freeze the funds or assets of designated persons or entities without prior notice. This applies to, number one, all funds or assets owned or controlled by the designated person or entity, not just those linked to a specific terrorist act or threat. Number two, funds or assets jointly owned or controlled, directly or indirectly, by the designated persons or entities. Number three, funds or assets generated from or connected to those owned or controlled by the designated persons or entities, as well as those held by individuals or entities acting on their behalf or under their directions. Number B, countries should forbid their citizens and anyone within their borders from providing funds, assets, economic resources, or financial services, whether directly or indirectly, fully or partially, to benefit, number one, designated persons or entities. Number 2, entities owned or controlled by them. And number 3, people or entities acting on their behalf or under their direction. This is unless it is specifically allowed or approved according to relevant Security Council resolutions. Subnote C. Countries should have systems to immediately inform the financial sector and DNFBPs, otherwise meaning designated non-financial businesses and professions, when designations are made. They should also give clear instructions, especially to financial institutions and entities holding targeted funds or assets, on their responsibilities when freezing those assets. Subnote D. Countries should require financial institutions and DNFBPs to report any frozen assets or actions taken to comply with the Security Council resolutions, including attempted transactions, to the relevant authorities. These authorities should effectively use the reported information. And subnote E, countries should implement effective measures to protect the rights of genuine third parties acting in good faith while carrying out the obligations under Recommendation 6. Section D concerns delisting, unfreezing, and providing access to frozen funds or other assets. And Interpretative Note 7 asserts that countries should establish and implement public procedures for submitting delisting requests to the UN Security Council for individuals or entities designated under Resolution 1267 and its successors if they believe the criteria for designation are no longer met. Once a person or entity is delisted by the 1267 or 1988 committees, the freezing obligation is then lifted. For Al-Qaeda-related delisting requests, the procedures must follow the guidelines set by the 1267 committee under various UN Security Council resolutions. For Taliban-related delisting, the procedures must align with those of the 1988 committee under similar resolutions, which include UNSC resolutions 1730 of the year 2006, 1735 of the year 2006, 1822 of the year 2008, 1904 of the year 2009, 1988 of the year 2011, and any successor UN resolutions. Interpretative Note 8, still on the same subject matter, argues that for individuals and entities designated under UN Resolution 1373, countries should have the legal powers and processes to remove them from the list and unfreeze their assets if they no longer meet the designation criteria. Additionally, countries should have procedures that allow people to request a review of the designation decision by a court or independent authority. Interpretative Note 9, still on the same subject matter, states that if individuals or entities with similar names to those designated are wrongly affected by a freezing mechanism, countries should create and publicize procedures to quickly unfreeze their assets once it is confirmed that they are not actually designated. Interpretative Note 10, still once again on the same subject matter, stipulates that countries should allow access to frozen funds or assets for basic needs, certain fees, or extraordinary expenses if deemed necessary. This should be done following the procedures in UN Security Council Resolution 1452 of the year 2002 and its successors. Similarly, access should be authorized under similar conditions for assets frozen by supranational authorities under Resolution 1373 and Resolution 1963 of the year 2010. And Interpretative Note 11, still once again on the same subject matter, asserts that countries should have a system allowing designated individuals or entities to challenge their designation and seek a review by a competent authority or court. For designations on the Al-Qaeda sanctions list, countries should also inform those designated about the option to file delisting petitions with the United Nations Office of the Ombudsperson as per Resolution 1904 of the year 2009. And finally, the last interpretative note on the same subject matter, being number 12, argues that countries should have systems to quickly inform the financial sector and DNFBPs about delistings and unfreezings. They should also provide clear guidance to financial institutions and others holding targeted funds or assets on how to comply with these actions. Lastly, we have Section E on the Designated Nations Designation Criteria, where interpretative note 13 states that the criteria for designation as specified in the relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions are: A. Security Council Resolutions 1267, 1989 and their successor resolutions. Subnote 1. Direct involvement with Al-Qaeda. This includes anyone or any group that is involved in financing, planning, facilitating, preparing, or carrying out activities for Al-Qaeda or its affiliates, supplying, selling, or transferring weapons and related materials to Al-Qaeda, and recruiting for Al-Qaeda or supporting its activities in any way. Number 2, entities owned or controlled by designated individuals. This includes any organization that is owned or controlled directly or indirectly by someone or a group that has been designated due to their association with Al-Qaeda or by anyone acting on their behalf. B. Security Council Resolutions 1267, 1988 and their successor resolutions. Number 1, involvement with the Taliban. This includes any person or entity involved in financing, planning, facilitating, or carrying out activities for the Taliban or associated individuals, groups, or entities, supplying or transferring arms and related materials to the Taliban or recruiting for the Taliban or otherwise supporting their activities. And number 2, entities owned or controlled by designated individuals. This includes any organization owned or controlled directly or indirectly by someone designated due to their association with the Taliban or by individuals acting on their behalf. C. Security Council Resolution 1373 of 2001. Number 1, terrorist activities. Any person or entity involved in committing or attempting to commit terrorist acts or in facilitating such acts. Number 2, entities owned or controlled by designated individuals. Any organization owned or controlled directly or indirectly by someone designated due to their involvement in terrorist activities. Number 3, acting on behalf of designated individuals, meaning any person or entity acting on behalf of or under the direction of someone designated for involvement in terrorist activities. As a general overview and summary, Recommendation 6 of the Financial Action Task Force focuses on targeted financial sanctions related to terrorism and terrorist financing. It mandates that countries implement measures to comply with the UNSC resolutions relating to the prevention and suppression of terrorism and terrorist financing. This includes freezing funds or other assets of persons involved in terrorism without delay, in line with UN sanctions regimes. Key requirements include: number 1, freezing of funds. Countries must have legal frameworks allowing the immediate freezing of funds or assets of individuals or entities designated by the UNSC as being involved in terrorism or terrorist financing. Number 2, prohibition of fund provision. It prohibits the provision of financial resources to designated persons or entities, including direct or indirect financial support for terrorism or terrorist activities. Number 3, effectiveness in enforcement. Countries must ensure effective enforcement of the sanctions, including freezing of assets and prohibiting access to financial services for sanctioned individuals or groups. Number 4, due process. It also requires that individuals or entities affected by sanctions are provided with access to procedures to challenge their designation through a fair and transparent process. And number 5, international cooperation. Countries are encouraged to share information and cooperate with international efforts to counter terrorist financing, as well as updating their lists of designated persons and entities in line with UN designations. This recommendation is critical in aligning national laws with international obligations to counter terrorism financing and restrict the flow of funds to terrorist groups. By enforcing this, the FATF aims to cut off financial resources that could be used to support terrorism globally. That's it for today's video on Recommendation 6 issued by the Financial Action Task Force. Thank you for sticking around until the end. Your support, as always, means a lot to us, and we hope you found the information, insights, and key points valuable. We'll continue to share informative content every week, so don't hesitate to return to the Global Business channel for insightful videos on the offshore, global, compliance, and financial services sectors. Take care, stay safe, and we'll catch you in the next one. Cheerios!